I'm a Nintendo Game Boy baby. The DMG-01 was my first gaming console, and Tetris was the first game I ever owned. It's fair to say that the Game Boy set me on a relentless path of finding the perfect handheld gaming device that I am still enthralled with today. Advancing technology has completely opened the floodgates to handheld gaming, and we've gotten products from an abundance of makers that I would have salivated over a couple decades ago. At the top of the mountain is this handheld, and it might just be the best Game Boy ever made. It just isn't made by Nintendo. The Analog Pocket may very well be the most premium Game Boy to ever exist at this point in time. It's a larger body than any official Game Boy to release, but it fits really well into an adult hand. There are plenty of Game Boy replicas out there, but the Pocket just feels special. The first thing that will immediately catch your eye is the 3.5-inch LCD screen. For many handheld enthusiasts, this display will be the sharpest, the brightest, and the most eye-pleasing display on a handheld of this form factor. It may not be the most accurate way to replicate the vision that a Game Boy screen projected in the past, but it's literally 10 times sharper than the original Game Boy. Seriously, a 1600 by 1440p resolution at this small size pushes the count to 615 ppi. That's an incredibly sharp display that is just a joy to look at. I'm not one to completely relive the nostalgia of the 90s with the whole non-backlit screens or pixel grid patterns, but you can actually do that digitally through the Pocket as well. The hardware on the Analog Pocket does let that LCD screen display these things to recreate the original hardware look for the Game Boy Color, and also Game Boy Advanced. Scan lines can be modified a few levels, as well as the color of that, the platform that would have emitted whatever it was on the real hardware. There's enough here for anyone to simulate their past experiences with this handheld gaming device. It's also a given that a modern Game Boy will allow users to tinker with the aspect ratio to once again try to capture a certain authenticity to the playing experience of a cartridge game in the 1990s. The main function of a Pocket will be to relive the golden age of Nintendo mobile gaming. Gamers can take their old cartridges and insert them into the back, just like the Game Boy Color used to house those cartridges there all those years ago. The Pocket's game reader is natively compatible with Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games cartridges. Analog does sell cartridge adapters that will also allow the Pocket to plug into games for the Game Gear, the Neo Geo Pocket, and also the Atari Lynx as well. All in all, this is a one-stop shop to play the classics legitimately through files owned by gamers from the past. That's a value that is hard to replicate to this extent. Sure, you can buy these things individually, these consoles individually, to authentically have that throwback experience, but that price kind of gathers up when you think about how compact this Pocket is and how it has it all together in one. I can see the appeal and why this is beneficial to retro gamers. FPGA is tailor-made for retro gaming, and playing classics on the Analog Pocket does it so cleanly. That's not even including the modern gaming amenities like the beautiful and bright display. How about being able to put the console to sleep without needing to save progress so you can pick it back up and start where you left off? Save states are also something that I guess once I've adapted to it with modern gaming, it's hard to live without going back to the whole rough, do or die levels of the Game Boy Play, where when you die, you have to start all over from the scratch. But a huge addition to the Pocket's functionality is due to OpenFPGA and the ability to play ROMs. Running FPGA cores of various systems expands my gaming library to more than just that of my portable systems. It also allows me to leave the cartridges home when I'm not in a position to carry a wider library of games out with me. This is what we've come to rely on in the retro handheld community, and it's vital that the Pocket obtain this ability to remain competitive in the field, and it eventually did, which makes this a great all-arounder. While the general interface to navigate the menus is rudimentary at best, I'm happy to be able to play NES Tetris on a gorgeous display anywhere I feel like it. I sound like a broken record, but there's something magical about experiencing some of my favorite titles on such a high resolution display. Going through my library of titles just to see how beautiful the sprites looked with modern technology was enough for me to maybe warrant the hefty price tag of this hardware. Still, the Analog Pocket has done a fantastic job building hardware that is worth every penny. The games play flawlessly on the hardware while the buttons give off a snappy and a solid input. I also love the minimalist approach with the color scheme. The white is completely white except for a mint green powered button accent. All the buttons are white. It's just so clean and gives off this like snobby, expensive vibe. It's like Analog is screaming that this is a rich man's Game Boy, and I'm all for it. The Pocket is a little chunkier than most retro gaming replicas shaped like a Game Boy Color, but that helps with the comfortability of the shoulder triggers. It's not shallow like a lot of competitors out there, allowing for plenty of resting space for those index fingers. The entire console is quite comfortable to hold in my hands. I like the fact that Analog also chose to add a line texture on the rear battery compartment where the majority of my fingers rest when gripping the Pocket. This gives my fingers some friction to kind of keep steady rather than a smooth back that could be potentially slippery. Speaking of battery, the rechargeable 4300 mAh cell is impressive. I've probably logged about 8 to 10 hours of gameplay between each charge, but what I'm most impressed with from the Pocket is the terrific standboard performance. I just don't have that much time to game nowadays. I also don't have the energy or patience to game for long periods of time. I love making a little bit of progress in an RPG incrementally before hitting that green power button to put the Pocket to sleep. I sometimes then don't get back to it for days. I don't play that game again for days, and battery life wasn't drained to zero. In fact, it always retained a hefty chunk of what I left it at. This is exactly the type of adult gaming console I need in my life right now. Gaming is not a priority for me like it used to be in my teenage days. I can't afford to spend another 15 minutes more to get to a save point before calling it a day. I'm glad Analog understands this and has implemented a mixture of terrific battery life and also software assistance to make gaming more convenient rather than stay too stringent of a purist replication. The rest of the hardware aspects are also pretty sound for the most part. There's a USB-C port as well as a 3.5mm headphone jack. The stereo speakers are, in my opinion, one of the best ones out there for a Game Boy replica that I've used. It gets loud without being distorted, and for the most part, retains that clearness of what we have kind of come to expect with things like our smartphones. There's also a micro SD card for saving files and ROMs onto. But to some fans out there, the coolest port on the hardware is an original style Game Boy Link port. Yep, those same cables I used to trade Pokemon religiously on with the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy are also on the Pocket. You can seriously relive and re-experience whatever levels of authenticity you want with the Pocket. It's not completely perfect, as I would recommend Analog to separate the volume rockers from the power button further if they do make a sequel to the Pocket eventually. The buttons are essentially flush to the frame and are rather tiny. I've often put the Pocket to sleep on accident while attempting to lower the volume. Analog doesn't provide buyers with a cover for the cartridge slot. This isn't the end of the world, as the original Game Boy and its also sequel hardware also had exposed slots. It wasn't until I believe the Nintendo DS Lite that having a slot cover to prevent dust, dirt, and other things became a norm. I actually went out and purchased a DS Lite cover that also works for this, as well as a 3D printed third-party mold to cover my Pocket. I do think it looks better covered when not in use too. And finally, seeing as the Pocket technically is running on real hardware in a scientific sense, ROM hacks don't work here. That means if you're looking to run through some crazy Pokemon ROM hacks on the GBA, you'll have to find an emulator-based handheld to dive into. Even after a couple of years of the Analog Pocket, I find myself still giddy pulling it out and staring at it. It's beautiful to look at, the games are beautiful to stare at, and most importantly, this is probably where the games play best at. There's something so unique about cartridge loading that I never realized how much I missed this until I started using the Analog Pocket and also something like the Epilog GB operator that I reviewed last year. This isn't my main retro gaming console as it's limited in home consoles that I can emulate, but when it comes to Game Boy gaming in modern times, there's no handheld out there I would rather have in my hands to experience those games all over again over the Analog Pocket. Once again, I'm Alex from the Simnautics. Let me know what you think of the Analog Pocket and what you use to play your Game Boy games, and I will see you guys in the next video.